Good evening. My name is Reginald Cornelius Latson, but most people call me Neli. It's an honor to stand before you today, not just as a speaker, but as someone who has lived through unimaginable challenges and is here to share a story of survival, advocacy, and hope. For years, when I was locked up in solitary confinement, I daydreamed about getting out and telling my story. I wanted to be a spokesperson. I wanted to stand up and speak out so that other autistic people and other Black people and other Black and autistic people would not experience the terrible things that happened to me. Thoughts like that sustained me through terrible times. I imagine being here, in places like this, using my voice to make a difference. Today we are here to talk about the intersection of race and disability. In my story, race proved to be the prevailing factor that started it all. I am 33 years old now. In 2010, when I was an 18-year-old, just a week away from graduating and starting a new job, my life was hijacked. One morning, I was waiting outside the public library for it to open, and I was racially profiled. Someone thought I looked suspicious and called the police. They said I might have a gun. There was a lot happening that I did not know. When I decided to leave the library and head to the high school, I had no idea they were looking for me. It wasn't like I was hiding. I was walking in broad daylight. As I walked, I heard sirens and wondered what was happening. I just tried to keep walking so I would not be in the way of whatever was going on. I didn't know that they put all the local schools on lockdown. I didn't know that the cops were on a manhunt to find a young Black man who possibly had a gun. And I most definitely didn't know that young man was me. I soon learned all of that. It was definitely an oh shit moment when I realized they were looking for me. The police officer searched me for a gun because the 911 caller said I might have one. Of course, I didn't have a gun. I've never had a gun, ever. I was at the library for the same reason anyone goes to the library. I went to the library all the time. I showed the officer that I didn't have any weapon, but he kept asking me for my name. When I didn't give him my name, he said he was going to arrest me, and he pushed me against a car, and he physically restrained me. Disability was a prerequisite to the chaos that ensued next. Like a lot of autistic people, I am very sensitive to being touched, especially if I'm not expecting to be touched. I have what is called a fight or flight reaction, and that's what happened that day. When the police officer engaged me, he asked me where I was going and then started asking me to take off my hoodie, which I did down to my bare skin. And then he asked me to empty my pant pockets, and all I had was paper and half of a pencil. The police then began to harass me, asking if I was in a gang, asking about a gun, and I began to feel extremely anxious. I had complied, so I didn't know what else to do, so I began to walk away. Next thing I know, he attacked me from behind and put me into a chokehold. That's when I went into fight or flight. At no point did I ever punch, hit, or physically attack the officer, which the officer admitted in court. I was just trying to get away. What happened next wasn't justice. It was a failure of the system. After I was arrested, my mother tried to explain about my disability and what had happened. She also said loudly that this would not have happened to a white student. But this was 2010. The country wasn't yet talking about these issues, and the prosecutor did not want to understand. He charged me with serious felonies and got me sentenced to 10 years in prison. At my trial, the prosecutor actually used the R word against me. If you find that hard to believe, you can read about it in Ruth Marcus's article in the Washington Post. The prosecutor said that I was motivated by hate. He said I was using my autism and intellectual disability as a convenient excuse, and the jury believed him. After that, I got a new legal team. They work with the highest level disability officials for the government of Virginia. The people at the State Disability Agency were shocked by my situation and wanted to help. They came up with a plan for me to go to a residential treatment center instead of prison. And they offered to fund it 100%. But the prosecutor opposed it. So instead, I spent several years in jail and prison. Most of the time I was locked up, I was held in solitary confinement. Some of the time, this was to protect me from dangerous people. But a lot of the time, it was to punish me. Due to my autism and intellectual disability, I had trouble with the rules, and I got punished for that. I have what is called a fight or flight reaction, and that's what happened that day. Anyway, regardless of the reason I was in solitary, it was torture. Torture. I was not only alone in my cell without access to the light of day, I had no access to anything. Often I was not allowed even to have books or paper or radio or television or even access to a phone. Nothing. Just sensory deprivation. Sometimes I lost contact with reality. One of those times they decided to move me from one cell to another. An officer pushed me up against the wall. So maybe you can guess what happened next. Fight or flight. Instinctively, I turned around to fight off the attack. I was shocked with the taser, and then they strapped me for hours and hours and hours in a restraint chair. When that was done, they gave me a new felony charge and another prison sentence. So when I struggled with the rules, I was punished with more isolation, more restraints, and even new charges that kept me locked away longer. This is what our system does to people like me, people with disabilities who need support, not punishment. As bad as all that was, I know that I'm lucky. I'm lucky first because of who my mother is. My mother is a U.S. Army veteran. She served for 11 years here in the U.S. and Germany. And boy, oh boy, is she a fighter. She is the reason I'm even breathing fresh air. She did what she did for my freedom. She rallied everyone to get behind her. I never expected that. I'm glad people rallied and that they were sympathetic enough to understand what my mom was fighting for. She got things going. And then organizations like the ARC and the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network became my champions. Thanks to them and to dozens of articles in the Washington Post and other media, I was granted a pardon by Governor Terry McAuliffe in 2016. That pardon released me to a residential treatment center that was better than being locked up, but actually still felt a whole lot like being in prison. After a couple of years there, I was allowed to move to a group home, where again I was always told what to do and when to do it, and I had very little ability to control anything at all about my life. Fortunately, after I had shown that I would not be a danger for anyone, in 2021, Governor Ralph Northam granted me a second pardon. And now, thankfully, I have no more restrictions on my freedom of movement than any other person. Though those felony convictions still haunt me and create problems, then they still stay on my record unless I receive an unconditional pardon. I live in my own apartment now, and I get the supports through the Medicaid Wait Home and community-based waiver program to help lead the life I want. But I still have a lot of trauma to overcome. The trauma from all that happened immediately when they found me, and the trauma from beginning to end was the initial shock of the incident is something that will resonate in me today. I remember screaming in the woods because my eyes burned from the pepper spray. I remember when the dogs came running towards me. I remember when the officer said, "I'll blow your fucking head off." I remember when I laid face down on the ground with guns pointing at me. I remember when the officer handcuffed me on the ground and kicked me in the ribs. I remember being in the woods, hearing sirens, scared to death, crying, shaking because now I know they're looking for me. and I prayed to God that they didn't find me, and that if they did, they would show mercy. I am still today fearful, and it's hard for me to do a lot of things. I missed important years of learning. I am very sensitive to loud speaking and stern commands, and that now people who speak in high volumes tend to intimidate me, and I am trained to respond for better or worse and speak only when spoken to. It is still very alarming to go out in public and have people notice you. I just try to keep a low profile. It is hard not to be paranoid or walk on eggshells thinking about what happened, what could have happened, and what could still happen. Looking back, it always baffled me why I was in jail. I never expected that for my life. It didn't have to happen that way. The officer kept aggressing and escalating things when he should have been the one de-escalating things. Escalation should not be the first option. It should be the last. If a person questions why they're being stopped, that should not be a signal to the police for them to do whatever they want to. It is a violation of a person's humanity, and it should not happen. He treated me like an outsider. He treated me like an enemy. He should have treated me like a neighbor and tried to understand what I was doing there. Tried to listen to me, to know I was just waiting for the library to open. If he listened and approached me differently, it could have all been different. Recently, I thought about something that happened in school. I grew up in Fort Benning, Georgia, and I remember an exercise my teacher did with us about racism. First, the black students were given the good seats, and the white students were told to sit in the bad seats. Then it was reversed to show us how racism plays out in life. Afterward, I told my teacher that I didn't think that happened that way in life, and she said, "You'll see." I really wish she hadn't been right. I now know it is ingrained in our systems and our society, so very powerful now to look back on what she said to me. I was too young to understand how things really were. What I hope now is that things can change. We are in the age of awakening now. Many people are being exposed to what is happening to people in positions of power and becoming aware of the implications of police interactions with people with disabilities, and particularly Black people with disabilities. The stakes are high. You could lose your life. I want to have an impact. I want a better way to create unity. When there is hope, there is humanity. We must remember that we are all humans and we must look for the humanity in each other. All life is precious. I'm an advocate for change and the challenging of old systems and practices throughout this country. I'm against mass incarceration, particularly affecting disadvantaged and marginalized communities who may have underlying issues, doubling misperceptions of them in society. The activism and publicity about my case were not only helpful to me, but they have helped to make change for others. For example, the ARC of Virginia and many other advocates lobbied for and won new legislation that will allow evidence of disability to be presented in criminal cases and will allow diversion rather than prosecution in prison. And since my case, there has been so much more discussion of the issue of intersectionality and about how racism and disability converge in ways that make encounters with law enforcement, prosecution, and incarceration so much more dangerous for Black and brown people. It is not for the weak of heart to be a Black person in this country. My hope is that this curse of my experience can be a call to action for change in public policy and changes in people's understanding of each other so that others do not experience what I did. I think it is important to keep sharing my story because I am just one person who had their life hijacked by an interaction with police. But there are so many other stories that don't get told. Often these stories are not spoken from the perspective of the person with a disability, and these incidents aren't addressed, but instead are just thrown under the rug like these are normal occurrences. A lot of people are locked up that shouldn't be, like what happened to me. We should not just say that because someone is in jail that they deserve it. People deserve to be heard out. So many stories have more to do with social disadvantage than they do criminality. like things that are out of our control. These stories need to be told so things can change. My call to action: advocate to end solitary confinement. Talk to your members of Congress to ask them to pass laws that limit solitary confinement. Educate police on autism. Advocate with your state lawmakers to pass laws that require extensive training for police officers. Embed behavioral specialists with expertise in autism spectrum disorders in police departments. I grew up fast that day and I had to learn something most people don't on a national level of my own personal experiences: fighting demons and overcoming evil in adulthood, from adversarial conflict through intense battles, suffering, and emotional struggles. Fulfilling a now outdated stereotype of being a young Black man finally coming of age directly out of the school to prison pipeline. My humble hope is that the ones who are already here, the ones who live, will not have to endure in the way of the worst of society has to offer them. In a grandiose scale, on the world crash course collision in a nation full of fragile systems and shaky alliances, where emotions boil over and cooler heads must prevail as we burst forth in the fight of right versus wrong. In the battle and intersection of love, hatred, pity, and anger, you can't write a more poetic injustice than Reginald Latson. Thank you.